Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 2, Constitutional History, and it's Lesson 2 about constitutional antecedents. In this lesson, you'll learn about the Magna Carta, about the English Bill of Rights, about the Mayflower Compact, and what was the political heritage of Englishmen who came and settled in the New World. Now let's begin by defining that word antecedent that I used in the title. An antecedent is a thing that precedes and leads up to something else. The antecedents that I'll be discussing in this lesson are things that led up to the creation of the United States Constitution. I'm going to discuss three of those, particularly prominent historical events that precede the Constitution and influenced its creation, but by no means are they the only things that led up to the creation of the Constitution. There's just limited time to talk about such things in this lesson, so we'll hit a few highlights. The first of those preceding events we want to talk about is the creation of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a Latin phrase that means Great Charter, and it's a document that was signed by an English king named King John in the year 1215. Over 800 years ago. Now, to understand what the Magna Carta was and why it's so significant, we need to understand a little bit about how the economic system worked 800 years ago in England. It was based on a concept that today we call feudalism. Now, in feudalism, you had a few very wealthy people at the top of society that owned all the land, and then lots and lots of poor peasants, or they were called serfs, who worked the land but had no ownership in it. So these serfs were sort of at the mercy of the great landowners. If they didn't like the rules to be on the land, they got kicked off the land, and they had nowhere else to go because all the land was owned by some other big landowner. At the top of the system was the king. Now, kings claimed to be all-powerful in this age of world history. But the truth was, the rich people below them could gang up on them and get rid of them if they didn't have an incentive to keep them. So the king had to keep those rich people happy. And the way to keep people happy was to provide them with the thing that created the most wealth and status in the world this time, which was land. So for the king to maintain his power, he had to maintain a hold on land that he could then distribute to those who were loyal to him, to increase their wealth and cause them to continue to be loyal. So land meant power in the feudal system, and there were few people with the power. The masses had none because they had no land ownership. Now, if you live in a system like that and you're a king, and you want to become more powerful, then you have to go gain more land. That's why kings went to war with other countries to get their land, so they could then turn around and redistribute it to their cronies, which would make them more secure in their rule. Well, at this time, the kings of England would routinely try to gather land in what is today France. And they would routinely go to war there to keep the land once they had gained it. And the king at this time was no different. King John kept going to war in France for the purpose of gaining land. But there's a problem. When you go to war, you need soldiers. And King John was continually losing soldiers in these wars and had to replace them. So where would he go to get more soldiers? He would go to the wealthy landowners who were supposed to be loyal to him. And he would say, you need to provide me with soldiers. And they would get the soldiers from the peasants living on their land. So they would round up a bunch of peasants, send them off to fight for the king. They would die for the king in France, and then the king would come back and ask for more soldiers. Now again, I said a few moments ago, he was not being particularly successful in these wars. He kept trying, but failing to get more land to distribute to these wealthy people in his society. And they eventually got tired of this. Their peasants, who could be working their land, were instead off dying in France. And so that meant that they weren't at home to help add to the wealth of these people by working their land. So they rebelled against the king. And that led to what became known as the First BARONS'WAR. These wealthy landowners underneath the king were collectively called barons. They sort of ganged up on the king and threatened to get rid of him. And as a way to reach a compromise, he agreed to sign the document that is now known as Magna Carta. Now, what the Magna Carta did was it was a list of a bunch of things that the king would no longer be allowed to do. I said a lot of things. Now, I'm going to show you one of them on the next slide, but realize that that's not the only thing that was in this document. There were a lot, and they were designed to protect the barons in the future. So just an example of one of those things found in the Magna Carta is it says that no free man will be seized or imprisoned, skip down to the bottom of the quote, except by the lawful judgments of his equals. Now in America today, this is a tradition that we have had handed down to us after 800 years. It's the idea of trial by jury, that the government's not going to come and imprison you unless you're convicted by a jury of your neighbors and friends, your peers, that decide you're guilty. And this is where that sort of concept comes from, is from these words in the Magna Carta. Now notice what this does to the power of the king. The king can no longer just throw people in prison because he wants to. Instead, they have to be judged guilty by a jury. So this is what the Magna Carta did, was it took a previously all-powerful monarch and it legally limited his powers. He had agreed to no longer be an all-powerful king. And it was other members of the society who had placed these limits upon him. Okay, so now keep that idea in mind, and we'll talk about it more at the end of this lesson. The next historical event that's an antecedent to our Constitution is the English Bill of Rights. Now, to understand the English Bill of Rights, we have to go back even farther in history to a period in European history called the Reformation. The Reformation was a time period when different groups of people broke away from the Catholic Church. Prior to this, if you said the church to anyone in Europe, they would all know you meant the Catholic Church. That was the only church for Christians in Europe. Then there was a Catholic priest named Martin Luther who got upset about some things that the Catholic Church was doing, and he voiced his grievances. And people who thought that he had a good point ended up breaking away from the Catholic Church. They formed their own faith, which became known as Lutherans. And that was the beginning of many groups breaking away from the Catholic Church, forming what became known as the Protestant churches. And this was called the Protestant Reformation. Well, in the aftermath of the Restoration, there was a king in England named Henry VIII, who was still a Catholic. England was still a Catholic country, even as other places had broken away. But Henry VIII had a problem. He wanted to divorce his wife and marry someone else, but divorce was frowned upon by the Catholic Church. So Henry VIII requested from the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, permission to divorce his wife. He was told no. So he took advantage of the ideas of the Protestant Reformation to declare that England would no longer be a Catholic country, that they would become a Protestant country with a new church called the Church of England. He would be the leader of the Church of England, and he would give himself permission to get divorced. Now, a pretty convenient thing to do, but thereafter, the kings of England were Protestant kings like him. But the way succession works in a monarchy is king dies, his next closest relative takes over and becomes the king, then that person dies, the next closest relative takes over, etc. And through an accident of working its way through the family, ended up later with a Catholic as king of England, which had become a Protestant country under Henry VIII. Well, the people in England didn't like, since they were Protestants now, having a Catholic rule over them. So in the year 1689, the King James was chased out of the country. Now, he was chased out of the country by a body called Parliament. Parliament had been set up as a help for the king to rule England. It was originally a group of lords, wealthy, powerful people that could help advise the king. Eventually, there was another house added to Parliament called the House of Commons, which represented the common people. They elect people to serve there on their behalf. And it was Parliament, this body representing the people, that ran the Catholic king out of the country, and it became known as the Glorious Revolution. Well, they didn't just decide to get rid of a king. The idea of just never having a king anymore was something odd to them. So instead, they invited the king's niece, Mary, who happened to be Protestant rather than Catholic, to come and become the Queen of England and come with her husband, who was a Dutch prince named William of Orange, who could then become King of England. But when they invited William and Mary to come become King and Queen of England, Parliament did it with strings attached. They said, if you're going to come become King and Queen of England, then you have to accept certain conditions that we, the Parliament, are going to put upon you. And those conditions were found in the English Bill of Rights, which the king had to sign. So here's an example of the kind of thing that's found in the English Bill of Rights that this new King of England agreed to. Notice that it says that the power of suspending the execution of laws without consent of Parliament is illegal. The power of levying money for the use of the crown without grant of Parliament is illegal. The raising and keeping of an army unless with the consent of Parliament is illegal. You notice there's all these things that kings normally could do, but now King William can't do it unless Parliament tells him he can. And so from the English Bill of Rights, we get this idea that a popularly elected body, the Parliament, chosen by the people, can set limits on what the king can do. So the Magna Carta was the very notion that kings could be limited. Now we have the notion that a group elected by the people can be the ones to limit the king. Our next item from history that's an antecedent of the United States Constitution is the Mayflower Compact. Yes, the Mayflower Compact, which comes to us from the first Thanksgiving. Yes, the Mayflower that is talked about there, the Pilgrims who came and settled in the New World and almost starved to death, and then the Indians came and helped, and that whole big story. Well, they came here on a ship called the Mayflower. And as they were crossing the ocean to come here, now remember, you may recall this from history, they were fleeing Europe because they wanted to practice their religion according to their own conscience. These were people from England who, in England, they were only supposed to be members of the Church of England, but they wanted to do something else. They ended up fleeing the country and coming to America on the Mayflower. Well, as they crossed the ocean, they realized something, and that was that they were essentially sailing into the state of nature. This was an unsettled land without governments over it. Now, you may say, but wait a minute, there were Native Americans there. Not many, actually. When the first explorers from Europe came to the New World, they brought diseases with them that unintentionally wiped out about 90% of the Native American population. To a great extent, the land was empty when the European settlers came. It was an empty land for them to come set up whatever society they wanted to in. And they realized this, that they were settling into an empty place with no government waiting for them, the state of nature. And as we learned previously in this course, that's not something that a group of people wants to live in. So when they got to the New World and their ship stopped in the harbor, before they even got off the ship to settle in this new colony, the members of the party agreed to a document called the Mayflower Compact. Now let's look and see some words from the Mayflower Compact. It says that they're going to combine themselves into a civil body politic. In other words, they're going to create a government. But by whose authority are they creating their government? Notice that they combine them ourselves, it says. They were the ones creating this government. By their own authority they were creating it. It wasn't because the king told them they could go do this. They just did it anyway. And from this and similar incidents from other groups of people in other colonies here in the New World. First of all, we have the Magna Carta, which established this notion that the powers of government can be limited. Then we had the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights established this notion that, yes, powers of government can be limited, and they can be limited by popularly elected bodies chosen by the people. And then in the Mayflower Compact, we have this idea that government can be created by the people themselves as the ultimate power. Popular sovereignty, as we've discussed earlier in this course. So now let's review. What did the Magna Carta do? Did it set up colonies? Or did it raise a standing army? Or did it limit the king's power? Or did it establish a parliament? The Magna Carta limited the king's power. That makes it so significant. It may be the first document in human history in which a king agreed to have his power limited in a legally binding way that then had an influence on the government thereafter. Next question. What did the English Bill of Rights do? Did it set parliamentary supremacy? Did it set up monarchical supremacy? Did it create a confederacy? Or did it end popular rule? Now, the answer may not be so obvious here because I'm wording it a little differently than I did in the lesson. But think about what the English Bill of Rights did. It put limits on the king, and who put the limits on there? Parliament did, which made them supreme to the king in power, at least arguably. Now, in the decades after this, there were still battles back and forth between the king and Parliament about who was really in charge. But we had a king sign off in the English Bill of Rights saying, hey, Parliament, you're in charge of this stuff. Next item. The Mayflower Compact is based on what principle? Monarchical sovereignty, parliamentary sovereignty, popular sovereignty, or the state of nature? Now again, don't be confused here. The state of nature was relevant to my explanation, but that's not the thing that endorses what the Mayflower, the people in the Mayflower did. Instead, it's the notion of popular sovereignty, that the people are in charge and create their own government. So once they'd settled into the state of nature, then there was no government there for them. They had authority within themselves to create a government. And the last item, what is the political heritage of Englishmen? Or maybe I should say, what is not the political heritage of Englishmen? This question is supposed to find the answer that's wrong. Is it that we can have limited government, or popular sovereignty, or popular rule, or popular sovereignty? Or is it mandated equality? Which of these things did we not inherit from English tradition? The answer is mandated equality. That's not one of the principles that was brought with the people who came from England and transplanted here into the Americas. All right, that does it for that lesson. Next lesson from Unit 2 will be Lesson 3 about the colonists.